The city was always quiet at night, but tonight, there was an eerie stillness in the air. The streets, once alive with chatter and the bustle of city life, were now empty. Only the distant hum of neon lights filled the silence, casting strange glows on the alley walls. At the far end of the alley stood a figure shrouded in shadows, chained to the cold stone wall. Her name was never spoken aloud by the people who passed her by. She was simply known as the Monster. No one knew her real name. No one dared to ask. Her glowing purple eyes were a reminder of the unknown, the terrifying, the alien. Her body, marked with strange tattoos and covered in glowing lines, was a map of pain and torment. Each mark on her skin seemed to tell a story of suffering, of being misunderstood, and of being feared. She had been here for years, locked away in this alley, a prisoner of society's harsh judgments. People walked by her every day, but none of them saw her as anything more than a creature to be feared. The chains that bound her wrists and ankles were heavy, not just physically but emotionally. They symbolized the world's view of her, a being too dangerous, too different to be accepted. The woman had grown used to the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Children would point, their parents would shush them, and the old men who sat on the benches would mumble about her being a threat. It had become normal for her. This life of solitude, this life of constant judgment. Yet despite all of it, despite the fear and hatred that surrounded her, she still had a small flicker of hope. It was buried deep within her, buried under years of rejection, but it was still there. A hope that maybe one day someone would see her for who she really was. Not the monster, not the creature from the unknown, but something more, something beautiful. Every day she watched the world go on without her. People living their lives, laughing with friends, walking in the park, enjoying the sunlight. She was never allowed any of that. She was the outcast, the one who was kept, hidden in the shadows. But there was something about the way the world moved, something about the way the people laughed and loved, that made her long for a connection she would never have. She would watch from her corner, hidden away, wishing she could be a part of it all, wishing she could walk freely without the chains, without the fear. But she knew it was impossible. Monsters didn't get to live freely. Monsters didn't get to be loved or cared for. They were simply feared, locked away and forgotten. And that was her fate. She had come to accept it long ago. Then, one evening, something changed. It was a usual night. The streetlights flickered, and the cool breeze swept through the alley, carrying with it the faint smell of the city's exhaust. She sat against the cold stone wall, her knees drawn to her chest. Her hair, long and dark, fell around her face, covering the faintest hints of her sadness. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the thoughts that clouded her mind. But just as she was about to surrender to the darkness of her thoughts, she felt something. A shift. A presence. Someone was standing before her. At first she thought it was another passerby, another person who would stare, perhaps throw a stone, or worse, whisper curses under their breath. She had grown used to this. But then she heard a voice, gentle, quiet and calm. "Are you all right?" She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. No one had ever asked her that before, not once in all the years she had been here, bound by chains and trapped in the darkness. No one had ever cared enough to ask. She slowly looked up, her purple eyes meeting the gaze of a man standing in front of her. His expression was soft, not filled with fear, not with disgust, but with something she hadn't seen in years. Curiosity and maybe even kindness. He was tall, dressed in simple clothes, and his eyes held a gentle curiosity as they looked at her. But there was something more in his eyes, a recognition, a deep understanding that seemed to cut through the walls she had built around herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of the distant city. She couldn't understand why he was here, why he would stand before a monster like her, but she didn't look away. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen. His voice broke the silence again. "You're not a monster," he said softly. "You're beautiful. Her heart stuttered at his words. Beautiful? She had spent years hearing the opposite. Monster, beast, thing to be feared. But this man, this stranger, had called her beautiful. The words seemed so foreign to her that she almost couldn't process them. It was as if he had ripped apart all the labels she had been given her entire life, and was replacing them with something new, something she didn't know how to accept. For a moment, she just stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The words felt heavy in the air, floating between them, unspoken yet powerful. He knelt down to her level, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to be alone," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I see you. I see the real you." As the days passed, Elias continued to return to the alley where the woman sat, her chains glinting in the dull glow of the neon lights. He never came with any particular plan. He simply came because he felt something pulling him towards her, something that he couldn't quite explain. Every time he looked into her eyes, he saw a sadness, a loneliness, and yet there was something else. Beneath all the layers of pain and fear, there was a strength in her, a quiet defiance that made him want to know her, to understand her. At first, their conversations were brief, almost awkward. He would sit on the ground a few feet away from her, respecting the invisible barrier that had existed between them for so long. He asked simple questions, trying to break the silence, but she rarely responded. When she did, her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though she hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to be free?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at him, her purple eyes filled with a mix of surprise and sorrow. She hadn't expected him to ask such a question, and for a moment, she didn't know how to answer. No one had ever cared enough to ask her about freedom, about what she wanted. It was always about what she was, what she looked like, what she was feared to be. "I've forgotten what it's like to be free," she replied quietly. "It's been so long. I don't remember what it's like to walk without chains." Her voice cracked slightly, and Elias could see the faintest hint of tears in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, as if showing any sign of weakness would be unacceptable. She had grown used to hiding her emotions, to burying them deep inside where no one could see. "I can't imagine living like this," Elias said, his heart aching as he looked at her. "You deserve to be free. You deserve to live without fear." Her eyes widened at his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. The people in the town feared her, avoided her, and treated her as if she were a curse. They had never looked at her and seen her as a person who deserved love, respect, or freedom. And yet, here was Elias, someone who barely knew her, someone who could easily walk away, telling her that she deserved to be free. The thought seemed almost foreign to her. Could she really have a life outside of this darkness, outside of the chains that had defined her existence? Could someone like her ever be accepted by the world? "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "You don't owe me anything. You have no reason to keep coming here." Elias looked at her, his expression serious but gentle. "Because I see you," he said. "I don't see a monster. I see a person, a beautiful person, who deserves to be treated with kindness, not fear." Her breath caught in her throat. The word beautiful had been thrown at her before, but it was always in mockery, always a cruel taunt from people who didn't understand her. But from Elias, it was different. It wasn't a judgment or a sneer. It was a simple truth that she had never allowed herself to believe. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she had long since buried. Hope. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she could be more than the labels that had been forced upon her, that she could be seen for who she truly was. But doubt lingered in the corners of her mind. What if Elias was just like the others? What if after a while he too would walk away, unable to see past her chains and her scars? "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice filled with hesitation. "Why me? Why do you care?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. Because I believe that everyone has something worth seeing. Even you. Maybe especially you. Her heart raced at his words, and for a moment the world around her seemed to fade away. It was as though time itself had stopped, and she was left alone in this shared space, this small moment of connection. There were no chains, no walls, no labels. There was only the raw, unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to gather her thoughts. It was so difficult to trust again, so difficult to believe in kindness after everything she had been through. She had spent so many years pushing people away, building walls around her heart, believing that no one could ever see her for who she truly was. But Elias wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of her, nor was he repulsed by her appearance. He didn't see her as a monster. And that made her feel something she hadn't felt in so long: hope. For the first time in years, she found herself wanting to open up, to share the story that had been locked away for so long. It wasn't easy. The pain of her past still stung, still felt fresh, but there was something about Elias's presence that made it feel like it was okay to let go, to be vulnerable. I wasn't always like this, she began, her voice trembling but steadying with each word. I used to be different. I didn't have these chains, I didn't have these scars, but something happened, something that changed me, changed how the world saw me. Elias didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his eyes filled with understanding, as if he had all the time in the world for her story. And so, for the first time, she began to tell him about the life she had lived before the chains, the family she had lost, the betrayal that had left her marked both physically and emotionally. As she spoke, she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she could trust Elias. Maybe he could be the one to help her break free from the past, from the chains that had defined her life for so long. By the time the story ended, a quiet silence fell over them. The air between them felt charged with something powerful, something unspoken. And as Elias stood to leave, he gave her one last look. A look that said everything without a single word. I'll be back tomorrow, he promised, his voice low but filled with certainty. I'm not going anywhere. As he walked away, the woman was left in the quiet of the alley, the flickering neon lights casting long shadows across her path. For the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. There was someone who saw her, someone who believed in her, and that, for the moment, was enough to fill her heart with hope. As the days passed, the bond between Elias and the woman grew stronger. The quiet moments they shared, the deep conversations, and the understanding that seemed to flow between them gave the woman a sense of hope she had never known. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the chains that bound her, beyond the fear and rejection she had endured for so long. But not everyone saw their connection in the same light. The whispers in the streets grew louder, the townspeople more restless. They had seen Elias visit the alley more and more often, speaking with the woman, sitting beside her, and even offering her food and water. The once silent crowd began to murmur behind closed doors, their fear of the monster reigniting with every visit. Is he out of his mind? One man asked another. That creature is dangerous. They've kept her, locked up for a reason. It's not safe to let her roam free, especially not with him. The woman, now known as the monster to the people, had always been an outcast. Her strange appearance and the glowing markings on her skin made her an easy target for fear and hatred. But Elias's acts of kindness toward her had begun to change the way some people saw her. There were those who started to question why she was being kept locked away. Those who began to wonder if she was truly as dangerous as they had been led to believe. Yet there were others, those who had always believed in her monstrosity, who wanted nothing more than to see her stay in chains, out of sight and out of mind. As Elias continued to visit her, the situation became more tense. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked the streets, the suspicion in the air as he passed people who muttered about the danger she posed. The people were not just afraid. They were angry, and Elias could sense that something was about to give. One evening, as Elias approached the alley, he saw a group of men gathered in front of the woman's cell. They stood in a tight circle, their faces hard, their voices low and filled with venom. "This has gone far enough," one of the men said, his voice thick with disgust. "We cannot let this creature be free. She is a threat to us all." "She's been nothing but a burden to this town," another man added, his face twisted in anger. "She's a danger. She needs to be locked away where she can't hurt anyone." Elias could hear the fear in their voices, but it was laced with something darker, prejudice. They didn't want to understand her, didn't want to see past the surface of her appearance. They didn't care about the woman suffering her story. To them, she was nothing more than a monster, a thing to be feared and controlled. Elias stood a few feet away, hidden in the shadows of the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard their words, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Not now. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, breaking the silence that had hung in the air. "She is not a monster," Elias said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "She's a person, and she deserves a chance to live without fear." The men turned to face him, their eyes narrowing. One of them stepped forward, his face twisted in rage. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "She's nothing more than an alien beast, and you've been feeding this delusion that she's anything else." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Elias replied, standing tall, despite the fear that gripped him. "I've spent time with her, I've listened to her. She's not what you think. She's not a threat. She's been treated like a monster her whole life, but that doesn't mean she is one. She's been broken by the world, but that doesn't mean she can't heal." There was a brief silence as the men stared at him, their faces filled with skepticism and hostility, but Elias stood firm, his eyes unwavering. "We won't allow this," the first man said, his voice low and menacing. "The people won't stand for it. You're bringing danger to this town. You're bringing her here to destroy us." Elias felt his heart sink at the words. He knew that the town wouldn't welcome her with open arms. The fear ran too deep, the hatred too strong. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let them take away the one thing that had brought him peace, the one thing that made him believe in the goodness of the world. "Then I'll stand with her," Elias said, his voice unwavering. "If it's a battle you want, then I'll fight for her freedom. I'll fight for her right to be seen as a person, not a monster." The men exchanged looks, their expressions filled with disbelief and anger. They didn't know how to respond, but Elias could see that they were losing their confidence. Their words, though harsh, were filled with the same fear they had always carried, fear of the unknown, fear of anything different. They didn't know how to face someone like the woman. They didn't know how to deal with her. Elias's declaration of standing by her side had shaken them. For the first time, they saw someone who wasn't afraid, someone who was willing to fight for what was right, even if it meant going against the grain. They had expected Elias to back down, to abandon the woman to her fate. But instead, he had stood his ground, and that made all the difference. As the men slowly began to retreat, their murmurs growing softer, Elias turned back toward the woman's cell. He could see her watching him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and uncertainty. She had heard everything. She had seen the way the men had tried to tear her down, but she had also seen the way Elias had stood up for her. Elias walked over to her, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Don't be afraid," he said gently. "I'm not going to let them take you away. You deserve to be free, and I'll make sure you are." The woman looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Could it really be true? Could someone like her, someone who had been locked away for so long, really have a chance at freedom? "I'll fight for you," Elias said, his voice filled with conviction. "Together we'll fight for your freedom. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in years, the woman allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, freedom wasn't just a distant dream. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. The battle for her freedom had only just begun. But with Elias by her side, she knew that it was a battle worth fighting. The days after Elias's declaration of standing by the woman felt like a whirlwind. The town was buzzing with rumors, fear, and doubt. People who had once ignored her presence now spoke of her in hushed tones. Elias had become the symbol of defiance, the one human who saw the woman for who she truly was and not just a monster. But while he fought for her, the rest of the world was not ready to accept her. They couldn't see beyond the chains, the glowing markings, the terrifying appearance. To them, she would always be the alien, the danger, the thing to fear. The tension in the town built with every passing day. Elias knew that if he didn't act soon, the people who had wanted the woman locked away would find a way to do so. The fear they felt for her was deep-rooted, and it would take more than words to change their minds. It would take a demonstration, an undeniable proof that the woman was not a threat, that she was just as human as anyone else. The woman, whose name was still unknown to all except Elias, stood in the small room where she had spent countless years in isolation. The chains, though no longer physically restricting her, still weighed heavily on her heart. The walls, once a comforting reminder of safety, now felt like prison bars, symbols of the fear that gripped everyone who looked at her. But Elias had promised her something that she had never dared to hope for: freedom. Not just from the chains, but from the fear, the labels, the rejection. Elias had been working on a plan for days. His goal was simple: to show the people of the town that she was not a monster but a person, a beautiful, strong person who deserved to be loved and accepted. And so he made a decision. They would leave the alley. They would step into the sunlight, into the world, and they would do so together. It was time for the woman to be seen, not just by Elias, but by the world. On the morning they decided to take this step, Elias stood before her, his face filled with determination. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, his voice filled with kindness and encouragement. The woman looked at him, her heart racing. Her hands shook slightly as she took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. She was terrified. The thought of stepping outside, of being seen by the people who had branded her a monster, made her want to retreat back into the shadows where she had spent so many years. But Elias's presence was like a steady anchor, his belief in her unwavering. For the first time in years, she found herself trusting someone enough to let them guide her, to show her the way to something better. I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to do it alone," Elias reassured her, stepping closer. "I'll be with you every step of the way." With those words, something shifted in her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to hide. For the first time, she felt a spark of courage ignite inside her. She had spent so long hiding from the world, living in the shadows of fear and rejection. But now, with Elias by her side, she felt the weight of the past start to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by the belief that she could have a future beyond the chains and the labels. Slowly, hesitantly, she took her first step forward. Elias walked beside her, his presence a steady reassurance. Together, they moved through the alley, past the place that had been her prison for so long. As they emerged into the open streets, the sunlight hit her skin for the first time in what felt like forever. It was a strange sensation, warm, comforting, yet overwhelming. The people who had gathered in the square nearby turned to look, their eyes widening in surprise and fear. Whispers rippled through the crowd. They were not used to seeing the woman out in the open, free from the chains that had kept her bound for so long. For a moment the woman froze, her body tense with the weight of their gazes. But then, she felt Elias's hand gently touch her shoulder, his touch grounding her. She looked at him and he nodded as if to say, "You're not alone." She took another step forward, this time more confidently, her head held higher. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to think, unsure of what to say. Then, something unexpected happened. A child, no older than 7, broke through the crowd and ran toward her. The woman's heart stopped. Was the child afraid? Would she be chased away again? But instead of retreating, the child smiled up at her, a look of wonder in their eyes. "You're beautiful," the child said innocently, their voice filled with awe. The words hung in the air like a beacon of light. The woman looked down at the child, her heart swelling with emotion. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever seen her as beautiful, as anything other than a monster. But this child, with no prejudice, no fear, simply saw her as she was. The woman bent down slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She straightened up, feeling the weight of the past begin to shift, just a little, as the words sank into her heart. Elias stood beside her, a proud smile on his face. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when she was seen for who she truly was. The moment when she could step into the light, no longer bound by the chains of fear and judgment. As the child returned to their parents, the crowd began to soften. Slowly, people started to approach. Some of them still looked unsure, but others, those who had witnessed the exchange, began to see something different. They began to see the woman not as a monster, but as a person who had suffered, yes, but also a person who deserved respect, dignity, and love. The woman turned to Elias, her heart full. "I didn't think this would ever happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone could ever see me for who I really am." Elias smiled softly. "I always knew. They could. You just had to see it too." And in that moment, the woman truly saw it. The beauty that had been hidden beneath the surface, the beauty of her strength, her resilience, and the kindness she still held in her heart despite all the pain. She wasn't a monster. She was something far more beautiful than that. The sun shone down on them, and for the first time the woman felt free. Free from the chains that had bound her for so long. Free from the fear that had shaped her life. She had found her place in the world, and with Elias by her side, she knew she would never have to hide again. This was just the beginning of a new life. A life where she would be seen, loved, and accepted for who she truly was. The true beauty within her had been revealed, and the world was finally ready to see it.